For many players, Wrath of the Lich King was heralded as WoW's ultimate peak. Everything following Arthas could never be topped, and to some extent, they would be correct. The numbers themselves would prove that Wrath was the highest point WoW subs had ever reached when Blizzard had continued to post a subscription count on occasion. Wrath had shown it had no intention of slowing down either, as its sub count only climbed higher rather than a steady downward spiral with every patch. Wrath wasn't shy of dislike systems either. The famous mounted combat in both PvP and PvE was ultimately never received well by a majority of the player base. So, what made players so strongly fond of Wrath? At its peak, Wrath hit just short of 12.5 million total players subscribed every month. This would occur towards the final patch of WoW's existence, patch 3.3, Fall of the Lich King. WoW had truly become known as a worldwide phenomenon, and was the hot topic of discussion almost everywhere in the gaming industry. How did the port of an old RTS game reach such a mountainous size, when the original itself wasn't on the same level of playtime as WoW was? At this point, WoW already had the many systems and progression and MMO required to succeed from its predecessors of vanilla and TBC. Wrath was an enlarged version of what people already enjoyed so much about WoW, and almost perfectly captured people's attention. The Burning Crusade introduced arena-rated PvP, stronger class balance, more challenging raids, and new zones for players to explore upon flying mounts. Wrath would take these things and mold them into something even more enjoyable for players to play. There would be even more ways to participate in PvP, better class changes, the hardest raids, but the best loot for the time, and larger zones to sightsee. Wrath had also introduced a very new class, one that die-hard fans were familiar with since the arrival of Arthas in the original Warcraft 3, the Death Knight. Death Knights were wildly loved by the player base, and their usefulness was downright overpowered in all forms of content. Not only this, Blizzard added many quality of life changes to the game. Things like the barbershop, paid race changes, dual talent specialization, faster leveling, and the LFG tool. While some of these changes were received with mixed reviews initially, the community had grown to appreciate the usefulness of their additions, and couldn't imagine a world without them. Though subscriber count jumped upwards at the announcement of Wrath, it's easy to believe this is because of the reveal of Arthas. The story of Arthas' downfall has been told to death many times over. Warcraft 3 players were more than excited to get their hands on the new version of their favorite game, but the ending had left many players unsatisfied. Arthas would climb the massive tower and claim the Helm of Domination and become the Lich King in full, but the fall of the former Lord-around Prince had ended there. Players were unsure of what would happen next, and were eager at the arrival of their favorite Death Knight to come back. With the announcement and continuation of Wrath, however, word spread quickly and players everywhere shared the news. And the players who had been kept waiting for half a decade would finally learn what's next. The pros of Wrath were so high that no matter what kind of player you were during its time, there was always something for you to do. Whether that was to farm badges for your PvE gear, push your PvP score, or just collect achievement rewards for the many new additions Wrath brought with it. Achievements had reinvigorated all of WoW's history, as now there was a true reason to return to older content and prove your dedication. It could be things as simple as exploring zones in entirety, or as advanced as completing the toughest raids without a single death in the entire run. Needless to say, Wrath brought with it insanely new ways to approach the endgame, and allowed players to explore this freedom at their own pace. There weren't many cons to the game's longevity, but things like the gear score add-on, vehicle combat, and debatably the LFG tool, players seemed to ignore these glaring issues. Finding a group for pug runs could be difficult, as lots of the community had this add-on to tell them on inspection how geared you were rather than your actual skill and content. A player could be invited with a large gear score but perform terribly, as opposed to the raider with a lower gear score and execute mechanics flawlessly, and with solid damage to par. With the release of Classic Wrath, we've seen these issues repeat themselves, but this time with the removal of LFG until Phase 4, making group finding much tougher on the more casual players of Wrath. Regardless, the player count remains at a staggering amount, as even now you can log onto a medium-sized server in Wrath Classic and see massive influxes of player characters running around Dalaran performing their usual activities. Wrath gave you a reason to log in every day and see your fellow guildmates in chat talking up a storm with their weekly and daily quests, and even for alt characters this held true. People were always looking for something to do in preparation for their raids, and for Wrath's time, these raids were legitimately challenging. This contributed to the overall lack of add-ons at the time. Accurate guides on bosses and classes, and players generally weren't as good at the game as they are now. It's also hard to ignore the content in Wrath was always new to players, experiencing things differently with every coming patch, whereas in Classic, the content had existed for over 15 years and had been practiced repeatedly and documented the most effective strategies for all to read and learn upon, yet players continue to enjoy the content it provided. WoW players like gear and big numbers. When certain players could no longer keep up with the fast-paced gameplay retail had soon begun to ask of them, they turned to the more relaxed version of their favorite MMO. Wrath content was just right in the department of not too easy for you to fall asleep at your keyboard, but not too hard to require tons of weak ores and add-ons in order to get an easier understanding of the content ahead. Players like to be rewarded for their efforts too, as Wrath's loot was much more optimized and special than retail. So there was a point every class would want something different, and with a little bit of RNG and grinding, they could start doing more damage within just a few weeks or less. Wrath's content had been done over and over at this point. The purpose of the game is to truly push the limit Blizzard allows within their game, and see how big of a number they can reach, either solo or with a rate of 25. But even again with the Wrath's re-release, there are some players who never got to experience the wonders that were hailed to the Lich King. It's brought entirely new eyes to the fandom of WoW, and many veteran players are more than happy to share this bond with people, like reliving the old days where the only tool you had to learn were the people around you. Blizzard at this stage had masterfully crafted an understanding in their audience that solo progression was just as important as the endgame group content. Not only would players have great incentives to log on each day to do their dailies for loot, but the leveling of Wrath was on another level. You would begin with your faction on either a Zeppelin or a boat to Northrend, and you would immediately be thrust into the war that has been ongoing with the Scourge. It's difficult to ignore the story that's being told by Blizzard as you go through the zones, as they had just begun to use more voice lines and speech bubbles more often, rather than just the text when you accept a quest. Even if you were to ignore these things, you could feel what the environment felt in those zones you leveled in. For example, within Dragonblight, you could see the corpses of fallen dragons around you, the Scourge attempting to use necromancy to bring back these dragons, and the shrines of the 4 dragonflights themselves corresponding differently for each flight. The zones themselves tell a story, and it's easy for players to learn what's happening around them. Not just this, but even the music of the zones in Wrath had managed to become the fan favorites of many all around the community, especially Grizzly Hills. In top moments where you're fending yourself against the Scourge, the music can kick in and fill you with either dread or hope. The dread of how truly unmatched the players are against the Lich King's forces, but the hope that you can fight until your last. With each patch, players would get closer and closer to the eventual downfall of the Lich King himself. More lore being added, and there was even a point your might was tested against the strongest lieutenants of the Scourge to prove you were worthy of the task ahead. You'd begin at conquering Naxxramas, storming the halls of Ulduar, and showing your strength in the Tournament of Champions. This is what players since Warcraft 3 had been waiting for. This long and steady upward hill to finally face the Lich King himself and see what would happen to their beloved character. By now, many had learned of Arthas' goals, and even some wished Blizzard had added the option to join the Lich King. Though, with the release of patch 3.3, as the patch name suggests, the Lich King would ultimately fall to the players. However, as Arthas drifts away, his father assures Tyrion that there must always be a Lich King. Tyrion believes he must be the one to bear this burden, but it's there where we see Bolvar reveal himself and is soon to be crowned the Lich King. And we are once again left in wonder about what may happen, similar to the ending of Warcraft 3. Bolvar had been a character players had known since the release of Vanilla WoW, as Varian Wrynn was missing and Anduin was in his stead. But since Anduin was just a boy, Bolvar was known as his pseudo-replacement for now. Players had grown to love Bolvar. Most definitely the Alliance, as he had been with them since the beginning and worked closely with diehard fans to thwart the actions of Onyxia. During Wrath's existence, Blizzard would release their very first in-game cinematic. At the time, this was unheard of and completely revolutionary to the game's storytelling, and many more cinematics would follow in its name. Seeing the Lich King, Horde, Alliance, and eventually the Forsaken in action with so many moving parts was fascinating to fans, and they were left asking Blizzard for more. This is where we learned that the long-known Bolvar 4 dragon had perished in their attempt to storm the Wrathgate. This was true until we learned the Lich King had retrieved his body and was tormenting him and planned to make Bolvar one of his most powerful Death Knights, but first wanted to use him as bait in taunting the forces that opposed him. Once we had beaten Arthas and saw Bolvar take up the crown, it left players in a state of, whoa, that was crazy. And all they do is tell others and spark conversations on every corner of the internet. This is what sparks the remembrance of Wrath of the Lich King. You could attribute the success to many things. Some people play just a roleplay and create their own stories in the game Blizzard had created, and that's more than fine. Though Wrath's success had been more than attributed to its players. The sheer wonder and love they had, and spreading the word to others about this enjoyment they had, was enough to bring in more players around the world. The gaming community was talking about WoW and its success Wrath had brought, and people were eager to see what the fuss was all about. Gamers in general would become united and be able to relate one thing that they could talk about for hours on end to each other. People would make many friends and other lifelong partners in real life. Blizzard had, whether knowingly or not, shifted all attention into their biggest game by showing off what they were capable of. Without the ease of access and speaking to people in-game, WoW may have never succeeded in its launch, as the people and the interactions you have are truly what make the world to almost any player. Obviously, many people are familiar with what happens next, and after Wrath ended, they were left at a cliffhanger of the character everyone had been talking about, and now are unsure of what happens next again. Will we fight Bolvar next, or some other threat? The players wanted answers, and with Arthas gone, many were fulfilled with his story and more than comfortable in finishing their journey with him. The task players had set themselves to learn had been completed, and now all that remained were the sweet memories of the adventure WoW had taken them on. Of course, many people were excited for new content and are just happy to spend their time around the people they enjoyed in the game that they loved. Blizzard's track record had shown that the only way is up, and for as long as people continue playing, they will deliver what they want. So on August 21st, 2009, Blizzard announced a new expansion, Cataclysm, at BlizzCon. Players had placed their trust into Blizzard and were more than sure that they could deliver another project that would skyrocket their popularity and bring in even more people from around the world. Unfortunately, however, Cataclysm wasn't everything it had been hoped to be, and without Arthas in the picture any longer, the talk of Blizzard's golden child began to dwindle. No longer was the spotlight shining brightly down on WoW, and the people started to fall into a sense of confusion for what the expansion's theme even was. Not many could understand the story as easily as Wrath had presented itself, and it caused players to lose interest over time. Personally, I think the reason Cataclysm failed in conveying certain themes was because of the massive uptaking of a world revamp that they had delivered. Not just did many players have to say goodbye to Northrend and Arthas, but the old world they had originally begun in as well. There was no way, at the time, to revisit the original Azeroth, and people had difficulties connecting to the new main antagonist of WoW, Deathwing. Despite even vanilla hinting to Deathwing in his character through many quests and an entire raid, not many played the game for the story. But Wrath had managed to instill a great interest in its story. Arguably, I would say it was the themes of Wrath where the majority of the expansion felt hopeless to the forces that opposed you. Generally, the environments were much darker, and the quests held more insidious tones to them because it was what was required for Arthas to work correctly. As expansions have progressed, it's not to say players haven't gotten their share of grimdark aesthetics, but it's no coincidence that fans prefer the sort of edgier material they produce. A great example of this being Blizzard's Diablo franchise. Without the massive influx in conversation about WoW and what's currently taking place, subscriptions would begin to dwindle, and this followed with each subsequent expansion into Warlords of Draenor. It was here that the subs had nearly reached Wrath's level, and people were ecstatic for what was to come from WoD, but were soon let down by the many systems and overall buggy launch WoD had provided, showing an insanely dramatic plummet in subs. It was here Blizzard had then decided to no longer reveal their subscriber count to the players, saying there are better ways to measure WoW's success. Regardless, WoW would continue onward in its lifespan, and even to this day still holds hundreds of thousands of players, if not over millions like it once was. There's always something to do in WoW, and it's been said by players many times that the only thing that could kill the game is Blizzard itself, as its fans think they are too invested in the game to quit, or just can't leave what they've grown to love over the course of nearly 2 decades of content. WoW will continue to exist for many years to come, and hopefully Blizzard continues to improve the many things players love. Easily, players jumped at the chance to jump back into the old world, and it was such an overwhelming amount. In fact, Blizzard was completely unprepared for it. Queue times could last as long as 5 to 8 hours, sometimes more, and in certain releases of content within Classic, these queues reappeared. Many servers were added into the game, and just recently the inclusion of the Hardcore Classic was made, where if you die even once, your character can no longer be played. It truly revived the old feel that fans had, no matter the age range. For all players know, Hardcore could go so far as to Wrath again, and not only will they get to relive on fresh servers of Wrath, but with such an intensive fix that it almost makes WoW feel like a horror game. Even if WoW were to end tomorrow, players would take to all forms of social media and reminisce about their favorite moments from the game's history, bonding with one another about the game that had brought them together. This will conclude why I believe Wrath of the Lich King to be so remembered by players. It had joined the people under one banner, and all they could think of was their favorite game. If you were part of gaming during the years of 2008 to 2010, you most certainly had heard about World of Warcraft and the fandom surrounding it. Is there a certain reason you think that Wrath was so important to players that I didn't go over? If so, let us know down below, and we'd love to read about why.